Today's video lesson is going to be over the scientific method. This is a systematic approach that scientists use to basically conduct research and to test hypotheses. I'm going to go through and talk about kind of the main concepts, some of the things that you need to be aware of in terms of the scientific method. Many of you guys have seen this over and over again in textbooks. I really want to make sure that you guys understand certain takeaways from the scientific method. So first of all, the scientific method is a systematic approach to testing a hypothesis based on some observations. So basically, once something has been observed, by collecting data and just prior knowledge that a scientist may have about a situation, all right, they will come up with a hypothesis, which is a testable statement or prediction, but some other things that a hypothesis might be referred to as it's a testable testable is the biggest thing. Testable meaning that you can perform an experiment, with it. But it is a testable prediction, explanation, or answer to an observation. Now, so this hypothesis is a testable explanation or potentially an answer to an observation, all right? So let's go back and talk about these observations for just a second. So there are two major categories of observations: qualitative and then quantitative. So this is something you guys really have to know the difference between. So qualitative data is going to not be quantifiable. Qualitative data has to do with observations, such as there was an odor produced. So if the smell changes during or if you notice that, I noticed that the outside of the coin was turning colors, so you're noticing a change, you're making an observation, all right? These are going to be things that you observe but don't necessarily measure, Now, quantitative data is going to be things that you can measure, It's going to have a number attached to it. So you could say that I noticed the temperature dropped 4 degrees Celsius, 4 degrees Celsius, that is a measure of a drop in temperature, so that is going to be quantitative. Or you could say that the height of a plant, so if you're studying different fertilizers and trying to see, and you see that the height of a plant has increased by 4 centimeters, in 2 days. That's a quantitative measurement, meaning that it's data that is quantifiable with measurements and numbers, all right? So qualitative doesn't have numbers and measurements attached to it. It's not things you can count or measure, whereas quantitative is something that you can count and measure. Now, so I'm going to clean this up some. So basically, if an observation is made, there's some sort of change occurring, some sort of, some people say, there's a problem. Well, it may not be a problem, it might just be something that is noticed by scientists, and they want to explore the explanation or answer to these observations. That's when they come up with this hypothesis, Now, after a hypothesis is formed, there's going to be an experiment. Now, this experiment is used to test a hypothesis. And so an experiment's going to have several things involved in it. Experiments will have an independent variable. There will be a dependent variable. There will be constants. And there will be controls in this experiment. So I'm going to take just a second to talk about what's an independent variable, what's a dependent variable, what's a constant, and what's a control. All right, so the independent variable is basically what is being manipulated. So if you were going to test out like 3 different plant fertilizers, let's say fertilizer A, B, and C, okay? And these are different plant fertilizers, and you wanted to see which one of them works best on the plant, okay? Well, your independent variable would be the type of fertilizer, okay? The fertilizer is really what we're using to kind of drive this experiment. We're wanting to test to see which one is the best fertilizer, okay? Now, so the dependent variable is basically going to be the change or effects based on the independent variable. So if I'm going to use a different fertilizer for all my plants, and the dependent variable, how do you know which one's working best? Well, whichever one is causing the plant to grow the tallest, the one that is allowing the plant to grow the most fruit. So if you have 3 tomato plants, for instance, okay, the one producing the most fruit. So the amount of fruit, in this case a tomato, because tomatoes are fruits, the amount of fruit or the height of the plant would be a dependent variable to see which, or you could see how many leaves, okay? So how many leaves that the plant has. All right, so all of these are going to be, in theory, going to be heightened by the fertilizer. So whichever one's the best fertilizer. Okay, so the independent variable are the types of fertilizer A, B, and C. That's what's kind of controlling this experiment, all right? And then the dependent variables, which are going to be the things that you're observing and measuring based on this independent variable, based on the fertilizer, that this could be potentially the amount of fruit it has, the height, or leaves. You know, that's something that you have to decide when you set up your experiment. Now, as far as a constant, okay, constants are important. So a lot of times constants and controls get confused. So I want you to be clear on what is a constant versus what is a control. A constant would be like how much you're watering the plants every day. All right, so let's just say a constant would be something like, I'm going to add 2 cups of water every day to every plant. So a constant is something that doesn't change. I'm going to add water, 2 cups of water every day to the plants. They're all 3 the same plant. All are tomato plants, okay? So you're not using a tomato plant and then maybe a bean plant and then maybe say some marigold flowers. You're not using 3 different types of plants. You're using all tomato plants with the 3 fertilizers, okay? So constants are going to be those things that don't change throughout the experiment. It's something that's going to be the same throughout the experiment, all right? Or you could say the amount of sunlight that they get every day. You're going to make those constant. Constants are important because constants are going to allow for it to not manipulate your experiment. That is, not to interfere. You don't want, because you gave a different amount of sunlight to your plants, if let's say you let plant A get more sunlight than plant B or C, well then obviously that's going to affect your hypothesis you're trying to test, which is which one is the best fertilizer, okay? So constants are important in terms of making the experiment have no sort of intervening variable. You want to make sure that you're able to test that independent variable and have no interference. Now, what is a control? All right, so I'm going to erase some of this stuff so it's not so busy and then talk about a control. All right, so the control is important. All right, so I'm going to go over here to my plants, okay, and there is something missing. All right, you need a control because a control is important to know that your experiment is actually, it gives validity to your experiment. So let's say I've got a plant X. So let's say that I've got this tomato plant over here that didn't get fertilized at all, okay? So meaning that it is not treated. So your control is your untreated group or individual, okay? So in this case, this would be your individual tomato plant that did not get treated, okay? So the individual or group that doesn't receive anything. This is important because let's say that these 3 tomato plants that are receiving fertilizer, let's say that they all grow and produce just 1 tomato after 2 weeks. But let's say that this control, this tomato plant that didn't receive any fertilizer, has 3 tomatoes growing off of it. This would actually prove that none of the fertilizers are really helping. So a control is really important because it is your standard for comparison, okay? It is your standard for comparison, all right? All right, so we've talked about what are the parts of an experiment, all right? So what happens whenever your hypothesis, all right, does not get supported? So basically, let's say that control tomato plant I was talking about grows better than the others, then that means that fertilizer really doesn't help. You could make the conclusion that fertilizer does not help, and you would have to revise your hypothesis to figure out what could help your tomato plants grow better. All right, but then it doesn't have to do with the fertilizer. However, let's say that fertilizer A, B, or C, let's say that fertilizer C was produced the most fruit and it grew the tallest, then you are prepared to come up with a theory. And a theory is a highly supported hypothesis. It's why something's happening. So you would say that fertilizer C is the best fertilizer, and that's why that tomato plant grew the most, okay? Now, once a theory is something that has been supported by many experiments. So basically, you would want to retest, all right, if you found out that fertilizer C was the best one, you might want to retest and perform the experiment again just to be sure. Now, after time, okay, if you will come up with something known as a scientific law, and a law is basically just a summary of accepted facts of nature. So just so you know the difference between a theory and a law is a fact. It's what happens. It's like the what that happens. So with the tomato plants would not be a law, but if we were to say that, for example, that acceleration due to gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared, that's a fact, okay? Now the theory is going to explain, it is the why. It explains why that law exists, okay? So it is the supported explanation for why something happens. So a theory is a highly supported hypothesis by many experiments, and it's why it happens. The fact is actually what happens, okay? So this is your overview of the scientific method. You are going to have a mini quiz over this video that will follow, so make sure that you took good notes and rewatch if necessary.